So, congratulations, we've made it to the modern era. You may have been born during this time period that we're getting ready to discuss. We're going to talk about some things that you may remember, you may experience. So, hopefully, this lesson is going to be a little bit more relatable to you. I was born during this time period, so it is definitely relatable to me. Modern era. We want to talk about globalization, and one of the big things to understand about the world that we live in is that it is very connected. People don't have to spend days traveling from one side of the country to the other, they can do it in mere hours. But not only have we become more connected as Americans, the world has become more connected. We can do business with China over the phone and call through the internet. This is being more connected is called globalization. We want to look at technology. The rise in technology is one of the main things driving globalization. Computers, people with a computer and the internet can communicate in ways that they've never could before. Again, thinking to China, people in China can do business with people in America anytime. They don't have to get on a boat and go or on a plane. They can just do it instantaneously. The computer is not the only thing that makes business easier, but it definitely is one of the driving forces. Now, the internet is also going to make it easier for ideas to transfer, right? I can teach students who don't even live in my neighborhood and live somewhere across the state. I don't have to be tied to one place. A video can be uploaded in California and gets watched by millions of people. A picture on Facebook is liked by someone in India. So this globalization is for business and for social spreading of ideas. But with technology, we do have to look at what else might be happening. And of course, that brings up the issue of privacy. Are my texts and pictures and my phone calls, are they private property? Or when I put something on the internet, is it immediately public and I no longer have a right to privacy? What happens to the pictures that I send out on the World Wide Web? Do businesses have a right to check my Facebook page and before they hire? So in the world of social media, we see the line between public and private becoming kind of blurry, but we do want to look at what kind of consequences does that have. So there are social things that technology and globalization, but we also want to look at the effect they have on the bigger picture. Of course, what the effect of globalization has on the economy. The world economy is becoming more global, so our trading with other countries is becoming more global. We're going to see countries really start to work together on a much larger scale. For example, the European Union. The European Union is a group of countries whose governments are going to work together. Think of it like a club. Your country can join the union and you get the trade benefits and any sort of incentives for joining the union. For example, countries in the European Union adopted a common currency so that if you traveled from France to Germany, you don't have to exchange your currency. It's the same. So the European Union, they now have about 28 countries. It started with France and Italy, Germany and Belgium, etc. But they're all working together to reduce the trade barriers and make business flow more easily. So there's not there's a tariff between France and Germany, or there's no tariffs between Switzerland. So if they're working within the European Union, they're working to make trade go more easily between countries. And with this, we see the emergence of what's called GATT. Now, GATT is for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And what it does is it applies to the world, and it says we're going to reduce the tariffs between countries all over the world, and we're going to reduce the trade barriers between all countries. So trade barriers between China and India. GATT's going to be replaced with the WTO, or the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization, their mission is just to make sure that trade is flowing globally smoothly, that the tariffs are not hindering trade. So in this global economy, we have to have these organizations to sort of help trade flow more easily because we're so connected. So North America is going to do this sort of the same thing as the European Union. We're going to try to reduce trade barriers, and we get NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. And basically, it's going to eliminate trade barriers in the United States with Mexico and Canada. So there's no trade barriers in North America. However, with the elimination of trade barriers, we're going to see some issues, and that's especially going to be true with manufacturing. So if there's no tariffs or trade restrictions, that means that businesses are going to need to make their products cheaper, right? So Americans want to buy cheap products. So if we're going to buy the product from China, or we're going to buy the product made in India because it's cheaper. So American companies have to compete with that. There's more global competition. So to do that, they're going to have to make their own goods cheaper, and they do that by moving manufacturing out of the United States, where labor is expensive, to places where labor is cheap, like Mexico or China. So we're going to see with globalization an increase in competition and a moving out of manufacturing jobs from the United States. So with a loss of manufacturing jobs in the U.S., you're going to see a decline in labor unions. There's a much more service industries, waiters, waitresses, doctors, lawyers, things like that, not a lot of manufacturing jobs. Something that's also going to cause a decline in labor unions is that the baby boomers are retiring. So the baby boomers are no longer in the workforce, no longer a part of the union. And you're also just going to see a lot of migration from the north because it's cold, and people, when they get older, they tend to move south. And people just are tending to move south because it's warmer and the climate's better. Well, southern states tend to be what are called right-to-work states. Like South Carolina does not allow unions. We are a right-to-work state. So unions are losing members to people just moving to right-to-work states. With globalization also comes this fear that American kids aren't going to be able to compete in these global markets. We start looking at the education of kids in other countries like China and Japan and India, and we see sort of an education gap that maybe they're learning math and science at a faster rate. So to compete in this global market, we implement what's called, or Bush implements what's called, the No Child Left Behind Act, and what it institutes more testing and higher standards. So you can thank Bush for this test at the end of this course. It's supposed to make sure that you're learning what you're supposed to learn so that you can compete in a global market. With the increase in competition for jobs, the lack of manufacturing, there's also going to be a social shift in the family. We're going to see a rise in both parents having to work to make the same amount of money. And with the rise of both parents working, well, in a family, if mom's not home to cook, that means that you're going to have to get food someplace. So we see the rise of fast food. Of course, fast food is not good for us. We all know that eating hamburgers and french fries makes us fat. So we're seeing a rise in obesity. With obesity, we see a rise in health problems. Of course, if you're fat, your heart can't pump your stuff through your body. If you're fat, you might get diabetes. There's all sorts of things that come with health problems that come with being overweight. So health insurance, we see health insurance spike. Social Security is going to be a problem during your lifetime and your kids' lifetime because people are living longer. So even though we are fatter and we do have more health issues, we are learning how technology is advancing so that we can replace your heart, right? Your ticker's pumping too hard because you're too fat. We'll give you a new one. So we can replace your knees, and we've got 3D printers now that can print organs. So technology is really lengthening our lives, and that has an impact on Social Security because that means that people are living longer and need to be and are taking out of Social Security for a longer period of time. Right? People used to retire at 60 and die at 80. Well, now they're retiring at 60 and living to be 100. That sort of thing. So Social Security is something that you're going to have to face. Are we going to have enough money for your parents to retire on, for me to retire on? Is there enough of money available? And then there's rising debt. During our lifetime, we've seen an increasing amount of people take out mortgages that they can't afford, spend on credit cards, take out loans for school. So the amount of debt that Americans are taking on during this time period is also rising. So we're going to back up. We've talked about all of these issues are, of course, issues that have started in that they're ongoing issues. So we want to look at the presidency of George W. Bush because he's sort of seen as the president of the modern era, first president of the modern era, because he comes after the Cold War. He's the first president after the Cold War. George, this is the first Bush. As America, we have grown, we have become more and more dependent on oil. And so, of course, that's part of a globalization as well. As America grows, we need more oil to do it. And we're especially becoming more dependent on foreign oil, which means that we are going to see more and more involvement in the Middle East because the Middle East is a huge producer of oil. The U.S. is going to begin to try and take a leadership role in the Middle East. Before we of course, we supported Israel. We've always supported Israel, but we've never sort of gotten actively involved. But that's going to change because we need foreign oil. So a crisis in the Middle East emerges when Saddam Hussein, who's the dictator in Iraq, invades the tiny country of Kuwait. And Kuwait, of course, supplies oil to the U.S. So Bush is going to put together a multinational force. He's going to go to the UN, he's going to go to Congress, he's going to get the people behind him, and going to build support to invade Iraq, or at least push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And he gets it. He gets a lot of support saying that, Saddam can't just invade a country willy-nilly. So Operation Desert Storm was launched, and America is going to successfully remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. However, we're not going to get rid of Saddam Hussein. That's going to be left to another Bush. So when Saddam Hussein is being pushed out of Kuwait by American forces, he starts burning the oil fields and he starts dumping oil into the ocean, and it's a huge environmental hazard, and it all plays out on the TV, which is sort of amazing. I can remember as a child watching these oil fields just burn, just black, dense smoke just rising up into the sky. So after Bush, we are going to get Clinton. And Bush should have, or was thought to be sort of a shoo-in. He's the incumbent president. He's riding the high of winning this war very quickly with very little loss of life. But Clinton proves to be pretty tricky. So while Bush is going around campaigning on foreign policy, Clinton focuses on domestic issues, and he will say it's the economy, stupid. And he's going to say that over and over again. It's kind of true, right? If the economy is strong and people have jobs and they're happy, Americans have a hard time believing that anything else matters. So wars in the Middle East and all that sort of doesn't really matter. So his campaign works and he's elected. And in his presidency, he's going to see a budget deficit of about 250 billion. So when he goes in, he's facing a deficit because of the first war in Iraq. By the end of his presidency, he's going to see a surplus of about 525 billion. So he does a really good job of getting rid of the deficit and building a surplus. He did this by increasing taxes and decreasing spending. Of course, that makes sort of sense. Of course, no president's going to make it through unscathed with no bumps, and a lot of this is going to come with his opposition with Congress. He is going to try, especially passing higher taxes, right? He has a Republican Congress, and Congress does not want to pass these higher taxes, and they don't want to pass his welfare reform legislation. So he has huge battles with Congress. And Congress even actually shuts down because they're just at a deadlock. Clinton's also going to face some personal problems, which he's probably most remembered for. Of course, that's his illicit relations with Monica Lewinsky and having sex in the Oval Office. Congress impeaches him, and impeachment, again, if you remember back to Johnson, impeachment is just the process. It doesn't mean that he's removed from office. So they try to get him out, and he is impeached, but he's not removed. So he finishes out his term. And Clinton's seen as, besides his personal issues, he's seen as a pretty good president. After Clinton, we're going to look at George W. Bush. And George W. Bush is kind of interesting because of how he became election. So the election of 2000 was really, really close. Really close. It came down to every vote being counted. George W. Bush was, of course, the son of the former president, W.H. Bush, and he was running against Al Gore. Al Gore was Clinton's vice president. So to win an election, you need 270 electoral votes. The election was so close that it's going to come down to one state, Florida. However, in Florida they have some rules, and the votes in Florida were so close that the state law required an automatic recount of the votes in that state to figure out who won Florida. So Florida is deciding the national election, and the people in Florida can't figure out, well, who won Florida. So it's a tricky situation. This, of course, is before the days of electronic voting. This is when they still had paper ballots, and so you had these people holding up these cards and looking, and they'd be like hanging pieces of paper, and they'd be like, well, is that for this person, or is that for Bush, or is that for Gore? It was crazy. So the votes had to be counted by hand. The recounting of votes is going to get caught up in legislation and sent to court, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court, and there's going to be a Supreme Court case called Bush versus Gore. And it's complicated because, of course, in Florida, who should be governor of Florida but Bush's brother, Jeb Bush? So that makes it even more complicated. However, the Supreme Court is going to put a stop to the counting of the votes. They say this is enough. And they decide that Florida was awarded to George W. Bush, and so he wins the presidency by one electoral vote. So Bush takes office, and when he does, he's going to implement some tax cuts, right? So Clinton increases taxes as a Democrat, Bush repeals them as a Republican. And when he does this sort of throws the disparity between the rich and the poor. It sort of makes the middle class disappear. So with the middle class shrinking, there's going to be some economic problems. But of course, what we remember George W. Bush for are his actions after 9/11. So on September 11th, 2001, you're going to have 19 Al Qaeda terrorists hijack 4 commercial jets. Two are going to go into the World Trade Center, one into the South Tower and one into the North Tower. You're going to have another jet go into the Pentagon, and then the 4th jet is going to actually be commandeered by the passengers, and they're able to overtake it, and it's going to crash into a field. So we don't really know where that one was headed. But on September 11th, 3,000 people died. That's going to be the single most loss of life from a foreign attack on U.S. soil. So more than Pearl Harbor. So after 9/11, we are going to go to war in Afghanistan. And we go to war because we're to find Osama bin Laden, and he's hiding out in Afghanistan. And we have this idea of this is a war on terror. And Bush he makes these statements, and he proclaims that this is a war on terror. Afghanistan is run by the Taliban, and the Taliban is known to harbor terrorists. And we ask Afghanistan to turn Osama bin Laden over to us, and they decline. And so once they decline, we have a policy of not negotiating with terrorists, and so we invade Afghanistan to find Osama bin Laden. And that's called Operation Enduring Freedom. We're going to eventually drive the Taliban from power. Unfortunately, when Bush is president, we won't find Osama bin Laden. That's going to come underneath Barack Obama. We're going to start a second war in Iraq. And again, it's to stop terrorism. So if you take a moment to read this address by Bush, you'll see that the war in Iraq was to prevent future attacks. And we want to take this moment to sort of, let's pause and think about the Middle East. And the Middle East is one of those complicated places where there's always seems to be fighting. So let's just take a moment to sort of look at a map and understand what's going on. So here's Afghanistan, and this is where we're with the Taliban trying to find Osama bin Laden. We have here troops removing the Taliban. We know they harbor terrorists, and we know we don't negotiate with terrorists, and they refuse to give us Osama bin Laden. So moving over here, we've got Iran. Iran, of course, we talked about with the Iranian Revolution and the removal of the Shah and the Ayatollah coming to power. Iran, which is one of the most repressive regimes on the planet today, besides North Korea. So we really worry about Iran because they keep testing these nuclear weapons. And if Iran were to get nuclear weapons, we could see ourselves going into another Cold War. But remember that this is a Islamic state, and when you start putting religion into things, we know that they hate Israel. They definitely don't like the United States. So them getting a nuclear weapon could be very problematic. So then, now we enter Iraq. And Iraq, of course, is going to be sort of a carryover war in Afghanistan and this war on terror. It's going to be very short. It's actually only going to be 21 days of major combat operations. But in a State of the Union address, George Bush is going to state that these countries, Iran, Iraq, and then North Korea, are an axis of evil, and that's going to sort of cement in Americans' minds the need to invade Iraq. So we're going to go to war with Iraq. The goal of the war was to fight terrorism and to remove the autocratic government of Saddam Hussein and to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. So remember, Saddam Hussein was pushed out of Kuwait by George H. Bush. So George W.'s father fought a war with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was an autocrat and he was a dictator who was extremely horrific. He committed a lot of crimes against humanity. He was known to have committed genocide against his own people, especially against a group of people called the Kurds, and he used chemical weapons on the Kurds. So we know that Saddam Hussein had chemical weapons because he used them against these people. So this idea of an axis of evil going against terrorism and weapons of mass destruction sort of formed this trifecta, and we invade Iraq. So with the invasion of Iraq, we don't actually ever find the weapons of mass destruction. So this definitely undermines our why we're involved there, and undermines the war effort. But we stay, right? And we try to get Iraq to be a democratic country. We topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. You can see pictures of them pulling down the statues, and we stay in Iraq to help them rebuild their country and become a democracy. But we can't stay forever. So up until about 2008, with the presidency of Barack Obama, we're going to see a continued presence in Iraq, but then we're going to start pulling out. And it's going to be the longest war that we've been in since Vietnam. But what did we get for this long war? Well, the immediate results, we had immigration was restricted, you had tightening of visas, but the Middle East pretty much stays the same. And if you were to turn on the TV now, you will see huge sectarian fighting in the Middle East. So as America pulled out, the Taliban just started moving back in, and we don't really know what the result is going to be because we're still hashing that out even as this lesson is being given. But the immediate effect also of the war, of course, is going to be deficit spending. Wars are expensive. I say that every time we go to war. So we have huge amounts of deficits from the war. We're also going to get the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act is going to be very controversial because it was implemented to help fight terrorists, especially maybe ones that were in the U.S. So it allows the government a lot of control, especially over tapping your telephone lines without you knowing it, reading your emails, that sort of thing. So the Patriot Act expanded the government's power, and of course conservatives have a huge problem with the Patriot Act overstepping the bounds of the government and invading your privacy. The last year of Bush's presidency is going to see what has become to be known as the Great Recession. And this recession is going to be the worst economic conditions since the Great Depression. And we are technically still in this Great Recession. There's a lot of back and forth over, are we still in a recession? Are we out of this recession? We still have pretty high unemployment. But this recession starts in 2008, the last year of Bush's presidency. So what is the Great Recession? How did it start? Well, this is not an economics class, so I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible. Basically, housing is going to be one of the factors. Housing prices are going to begin to plummet, and people are going to realize that their house their mortgage is more than the worth of their house, and they're going to start foreclosing on their houses, just walking away. And there's going to be a huge spike in foreclosures. Banks due to some banking economic stuff that you don't need to know for a U.S. history class, they have a bunch of these bad mortgages, and it causes the banks to fail. So the banks are beginning to fail, and unemployment starts to rise. Because banks aren't going to lend, they've got to figure out what to do with all this debt that they have, and they have to be taking care of that, and they're not lending money. So unemployment starts to rise. So Bush is going to bail out the banks, and it's going to be billions of dollars are going to be funneled into the banks because the banks are going to be said to be too big to fail. So we've got a war in Iraq, war in Afghanistan, a recession, and who should become president but the first African American president, Barack Obama. And of course that brings us to modern day. Of course we still have President Barack Obama. So Barack Obama is going to be elected on this promise to bring the country into a recovery. He's going to initiate a second stimulus, which is going to be more money poured into the economy. And whether that's worked and we think that this is the right path is still debatable, because we don't even really know if we're completely out of the recession. So the legacy for Barack Obama, who you are living underneath right now and I'm living underneath right now, is going to be probably three things. It's going to be the Affordable Care Act, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about, which is his universal health care, everybody being covered. There's been huge debates about it. Liberals, of course, are for the Affordable Care Act and giving health care to everybody, while conservatives see it as socialized medicine and increasing the nanny state of the government and overreach by the government. Killing of Osama bin Laden is one of the things that's not debatable by conservatives and liberals over this presidency. They found him and they killed him. So the war in Afghanistan effectively ends. Now we have to deal with these troops in this war in Iraq, and one of Obama's campaign promises was to pull out the troops, which he did. And of course we don't know the result of that. If you turn on the news right now, it doesn't look good. It looks like everything that we fought for, all the cities in Baghdad, are being taken over by the terrorists and the Taliban. So we don't know how that's going to play out. And then of course the recession or the debt situation. Wars are expensive. This is a snapshot of the United States debt on 7/8 when I started making this PowerPoint, and it shows that the national debt is sort of spiraling out of control. A lot of it is on government spending for the war. A lot of it is government spending for welfare programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So the debt is something that is very much present on Americans' minds, because if you look at this, if you look here, if everyone paid taxes, like from birth, every citizen, obviously like if you're 7 you don't have a job, but if every person were paying, even the 7-year-old, this is how much debt that 7-year-old owes right now. If you take out the people that don't pay taxes, so it's just every taxpayer, this is how much you owe. So me as a taxpayer, I owe this. This is my portion of the debt, and I'm going to say that's a lot. It's more than I make in a year. So the debt is something that a lot of Americans are really concerned about. What are we leaving for our children? What is going to be our legacy? So we don't know what President Obama's legacy is going to be, other than we know that, as a historical landmark, we have the first African American president, and what his presidency legacy is, we don't know yet. I would encourage you to sit down with your parents and talk about these things, and maybe watch Fox News to get a conservative perspective, or watch CNN to get a liberal perspective, and that will help you understand the world you live in. So congratulations on finishing the class.